What I believe in is this timelessness, the timelessness of an attitude. Inspiration is taken from people that are living a life.
When we think about Ralph Lauren, it's not really about the clothes. It's about the lifestyle, the worlds, the image, and that's really what he built. He didn't just give us a polo shirt. He gave us a heritage we didn't have to inherit. He took the American dream and he polished it for the world. This is the story of how a kid from the Bronx became the architect of our greatest aspirations. This is how Ralph Lauren built a world. In 1967, menswear was narrow, grey, and unremarkable. It was a corporate uniform that felt too small for Ralph Lifshitz, the salesman from the Bronx who would soon become Ralph Lauren. His first act of rebellion wasn't a collection, it was a single item, the necktie. Ralph envisioned something more dramatic, 4 inches wide, handmade and crafted from exotic fabrics. He chose the name Polo. Even though he wasn't a player himself, he understood the brand. It represented the international sophistication he wanted to emulate. The break came when he pitched to Bloomingdale's. They liked the look, but they wanted the ties narrower, and they wanted his name off the label. Ralph refused. He walked away from the biggest retailer in New York because he believed in his vision. 6 months later, Bloomingdale's called back. The ties were selling out in boutiques, and the retailer finally agreed to his terms. At $15 a piece, a massive price for the 60s, he sold $500,000 worth of ties in his first year alone. The ties were a hit, but Ralph knew a piece of silk could only do so much. He didn't want to sell an accessory. He wanted to build a destination. To make the vision feel real, he needed a home for it. And in 1971, he opened his first standalone boutique in Beverly Hills. A decade later, he became the first American designer to break into Europe, planting a flag on New Bond Street in London. But it was in 1986 that he took a risk that most in the industry thought was very risky. He opened his first flagship store in the historic Rhinelander mansion. Because Ralph didn't just want a store, he wanted a new home. He spent 2 years and millions of dollars restoring the beautiful old limestone building to its former glory, and when you walked through those doors, you weren't met with racks of clothes. You were met with the smell of expensive mahogany polish and fresh flowers. There were hand-carved staircases, Persian rugs, and walls covered in oil paintings. It was the first time a designer had created a 360-degree sensory experience. You weren't just shopping, you were stepping into a total lifestyle environment. By the time you walked back out onto the streets of New York, you didn't just have a shopping bag, you had a fresh new identity. It was this mansion that sent a definitive message to the fashion world. American design had arrived. It elevated Polo from a sportswear label to a global luxury house, one that stood on equal footing with the centuries-old heritage brands of Paris and Milan. Ralph's world was never meant to be a men's club. In 1971, he realised the women in his life needed that same effortless wardrobe too. He started by taking a classic man's tailored shirt and narrowing the proportions for a woman. It was a simple move, but it shifted the entire energy of the brand. By the 90s, this vision had settled into its most iconic form. It was the era of the nautical stripes, the linen trouser, and the polished navy blazer. The thing about Ralph was that it didn't feel like fashion. It felt like a real wardrobe. There's a sense that when he's dressing a woman, he is dressing his wife, Ricky. His true, constant inspiration. While the rest of the industry was chasing grunge or neon, Ralph stayed in his lane. He stuck to a palette of ivories, tans, and navies. And his 90s runway shows were legendary for this, with models walking with a relaxed, unhurried ease. This solidified what the Ralph Lauren woman stood for, someone who didn't need to chase trends because she already owned the classics. It proved that his world was a complete aspirational universe, where the fashion was simply the uniform for a life well lived. Once the mansion was open, it became clear that Ralph wasn't just building a store, he was building the world of Ralph Lauren. And in that world, there were different neighbourhoods for every kind of life you might want to lead. The genius of it was that he didn't stick to one look. He created these distinct subworlds that all somehow felt part of the same universe. First, there was the Aristocrat. This is the world most people think of. The Hamptons, the ivy-covered walls, the pristine white tennis sweaters. It was a vision of an American nobility that felt timeless. even if you'd never set foot on a sailboat in your life. To Ralph, the navy blazer wasn't just a jacket, it was the piece of clothing that could take a kid from the Bronx and put him on a yacht in the Hamptons. It represented a specific kind of old money security. Then there's the polo shirt. It's probably the most famous piece of clothing in American history. But Ralph didn't invent the polo shirt, he just perfected the colours. He offered it in 24 different shades, turning a simple sports shirt into a way for people to express their personality within the uniform. Then there's the Double RL Ranch in Colorado. For nearly 40 years, this property has been the ultimate realisation of the pioneer aesthetic. It's a sanctuary where Ralph, Ricky and their children go to disappear into the landscape. And in 1993, this lifestyle became a brand. Named directly after the ranch and Ralph and Ricky themselves, Double RL was launched. It wasn't about fashion in the traditional sense. As Ralph called it, real stuff. The ranch's interiors filtered directly into the collections, with lived-in textures, weathered leather, distressed denim and southwestern patterns, pieces that were intended to feel like they'd already survived a century of work. But this wasn't just about the clothes. Ralph had a deep reverence for the craftsmanship he found at the ranch, and over time, that appreciation evolved. What started as a personal collection eventually turned into formal partnerships, like his Artist-in-Residence program. By collaborating directly with Indigenous artisans, Ralph finally bridged the gap between his Western myth and the authentic craftsmanship that inspired it from the start. Then there is the peak of his world, the one inspired by the silver screen. Ralph didn't just design evening wear, he designed the moment a star walks into the room. For this cinematic look, the fashion was defined by two icons, the tuxedo and the silk dress. Ralph was obsessed with the 1940s leading man, and he took that rigid black tie tradition and made it feel effortless. Whether it was on a man or a woman, his tailoring was about the power of elegance. It was crisp, sharp, and perfectly timed. And he'd contrast that structure with the grace of a bias-cut silk dress. In his 90s runways, these were his signature. By cutting the fabric diagonally, the silk didn't just hang, it moved like water. The thing is, these pieces don't shout and they don't need logos. Ralph was proving that trends are noisy, but glamour is quiet. By the early 80s, Ralph was conquering the closet, but he wasn't finished. He realised that if you were living the Polo life, your world shouldn't stop at your wardrobe. And in 1983, he launched the Ralph Lauren Home Collection. At the time, this was kind of unheard of. Fashion designers didn't really do bedding and bath towels. It was seen as down market. But Ralph saw it differently. To him, a room was just another scene in the movie. He didn't just give you a blanket, he gave you the whole atmosphere of a mahogany-lined library or a sun-drenched cottage in the English countryside. He was the first to realise that the Ralph Lauren person didn't just want to look a certain way, they wanted their whole reality to feel curated. So, how does a brand built on nostalgia stay relevant for over 50 years? In a fashion industry that's obsessed with the next 5 minutes, Ralph Lauren stayed obsessed with the next 50 years. His greatest achievement wasn't just building a world, it was creating a brand that felt like instant heritage. He gave us a history that felt like it had always been there. We live in a time where everything feels disposable and fast. But Ralph offers the opposite, the dream of something permanent. He proved that American style isn't just about denim and sportswear, it's about the aspiration to be a better, more elegant version of ourselves. Ralph stepped down as CEO in 2015, but he never actually left. Today at 86, he remains the brand's executive chairman and chief creative officer. Nearly 60 years after that first tie, he's still the one writing the narrative for every collection. In the end, Ralph Lauren didn't just design clothes, he designed a perspective, one so complete that 6 decades later, we're still seeing the world through his eyes.